going to look at lesson 3 now, and the battle for authority. Jeremiah 17:9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" Our heart is definitely deceitful, and it wants to trick us into thinking that we can be the authority in our lives. Supermom is wanting to deceive us. And so I want to, at the beginning of this lesson, first establish some facts about Supermom. First of all, she is rotten to the core. I want you to look, when you have a moment, at some passages, Genesis 8:21 and Ecclesiastes 9, especially the second part of that passage. Look them up because they really show us just how rotten our flesh is. So Supermom's rotten. And she also wants you to think that just believing in yourself will produce fruit. But you know, God says we need to trust in Him, that we shouldn't think too highly of ourselves. Psalm 118, verse 8, and Romans 12:3 are passages you should look up to see what God says. Supermom also wants us to have confidence in our own abilities. But you know, God says all of our abilities are worth nothing. Only what's done in the Spirit will last. When you have a moment, look up Philippians 3, verses 4 through 7, and Galatians 6, 7 through 8 and 17. Also Romans 7, 15 through 20 and 23 through 24. Supermom also wants authority in our lives. So those are the facts I want to establish. She's rotten. She wants you to think that believing in yourself will produce fruit. She wants you to have confidence in your own abilities, and she wants authority. So let's look at how Supermom wants to have authority in our lives. Really, she wants us to play God. In The Battle Within, I want to read for you what she says about how she tried to play God. She says, "I'll never forget the day I introduced the concept of initiative to my kids. They listened obediently and repeated the definition back to me in their sweet sing-songy voices. Initiative is seeing what needs to be done and doing it without having to be asked. 2 of them even offered ways they could show initiative, putting on their seatbelts before being told, or not using the neon blue toothpaste as an art medium on the bathroom cabinet. I was grateful for their insights. But then one son, who had sat quietly contemplating his siblings' ideas, asked me an innocent and perceptive question that made me stop in my know-it-all teacher tracks. 'But Mommy, how can we ever show initiative if you're always telling us what to do?' How could they indeed? Here I was asking them to have the foresight to see what they should do and then do it without being asked. The problem was, I was so accustomed to directing those little bodies and controlling their every move that I never even gave them the opportunity to do so for themselves." I could relate so well to that story. I think I've had almost the exact scenario play out with my own children, because I tend to let Supermom play God. So we're going to look at some contradictions between Supermom versus God's attributes and see how we should be letting God's attributes shine through instead of Supermom. Supermom is miscontrolling versus God, who is omnipresent. Now, omnipresence means being present everywhere simultaneously. I looked that definition up in Webster's dictionary. I may try to control every aspect of my children's lives. Supermom wants me to live in fear for their safety or worry about the what ifs and try to control everything. But really, this demonstrates to my children that God is not trustworthy. I'm not showing them that God is everywhere and that He's actually in control when I'm trying to control everything. How about Miss Know-It-All versus God's omniscience? Omniscience, according to Webster's dictionary, is having total knowledge or knowing everything. You know what? If you try that, it will wear you down. And it's actually very arrogant and prideful. Only God can know all. How many of you have ever actually, though, tried to tell your kids, oh, moms know everything? I've done that. It's really prideful. And we're not pointing them to the fact that God alone knows all and sees all. How about Miss In Charge versus God's omnipotence? Now, omnipotence, the definition for that is unlimited or universal power and authority. I'm going to read again a little bit from The Battle Within when she talks about being Miss In Charge. She says, God created the role of mom to be the great healer of ouches and scrapes and little wounded spirits, the fixer-upper of broken toys, and the one who discerns the motives of a child's heart and gives hands-down judgment on wrong actions. She even has the power to both determine and carry out punishments. But Supermom urges me to make the most of this power and to enjoy all the perks that come with such absolute authority over my children. When I'm exercising the full authority, I'm not leaving room for the Spirit of God to work in their lives. I'm not trusting God's power to overcome their sin and to convict them. I'm not trusting God's power to work in our lives in every situation. So that's how I exercise authority really in my own life. I try to play God, but I also try to exercise that authority in my children's lives. In 14 Gospel Principles, that book again, he says, teaching and modeling the protective beauty of authority is one of the foundations of good parenting. I should be modeling authority, but there's a way to do it, not in my supermom controlling ways, but in a way that as an ambassador, I point my kids to Christ. So first of all, I have to realize the central issue. At the root of every issue is a heart issue. My kids, every time I have a struggle with them, there's a heart issue. And recognize that sin makes us want our own way. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 15, I lost my spot, says, and that he died for all, that they which live should not henceforth live unto themselves, but unto him which died for them and rose again. We're not supposed to be living for ourselves. We're to be living for Christ, who sent his Son for us. So at our root, at the central issue of all of us is a heart issue, that we tend to want to go our own way instead of submitting to God's authority. And the gospel of Jesus Christ is what we really want to put forth. And so let's look at the gospel of Christ versus authority, and his authority, really. Authority work is grace work when it's done in the right way. Ephesians 6, 1-4 talks about we're to bring our children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And it does say in there, children are to obey their parents. But we, as parents, having our children obey us, have such a great responsibility that we are showing them God's grace in the way we exercise our authority. And so I've taken from that parenting book just some ways that we show gospel work through our authority. And the first one is exercising ambassadorial authority is doing gospel work. When we're doing it pointing to Christ, not ourselves, when we are simply teaching our children, being the authority God has placed in their life to point them to Him, it's gospel work. When we're helping our children understand why they do what they do, it is gospel work. Your kids many times don't know why they're doing what they're doing. They need you to take time to go through the gospel with them and remind them why they were created. Remind them about the fall and how sin entered the world. And then show them how they can have redemption for that. Show them why they did what they did, though, because they often do not know. Establishing authority early in little things is also doing gospel work. If you wait till your children are teens to start getting a handle on things, it's going to be too late. We need to show them ambassadorial authority while they are little and while the issues are little. And exercising consistent authority is doing gospel work. I've said this again and again and again. Consistency is key. When people come to me and they're struggling with something, their kids, oftentimes the answer is keep going. Just keep being consistent, because God works through consistency. And if we are especially doing it in the right way, God will use it to work in our children's lives. So be consistent. And then confessing that when it comes to authority, you are more like your children than unlike them is doing gospel work. Again, like we said a couple lessons ago, when you're showing the gospel to your children, when you're applying that to their issues, you can also be applying it to your own issues and showing your kids that the gospel's at work in your life too, and you're like your children. God is parenting you just as you are parenting them. And in discussion of authority, talk about the cross of Jesus Christ. That is doing gospel work. We have an opportunity in every correction moment with our children to show them the cross of Christ. That's an amazing thing. My kids have all had a time where they've accepted Christ as their Savior. And most of that came about because in every situation we dealt with them, we brought up the gospel as much as possible, and we kept pointing them to Christ. And so at some point they realized, hey, I have a sin issue that's bigger than just disobeying mom. I have a sin issue with God, and I can't fix that. I need God to forgive me of my sins. So talk about the cross of Christ with your kids every chance you get. That's doing gospel work. And my last point is to recognize that God is the ultimate authority. I'm only an ambassador. My children need to know that I am a representative of Christ. I cannot be everywhere or know everything, but God can, and He does. I'm going to close with a quote again from this parenting book. It says, their struggle with authority, speaking of your children, really does reveal the depth of the hold of sin on their hearts and their need for the grace of the Savior. And in that way, we really are like our children. When we admit that, we are able to exercise authority with humility and grace, giving our children a little picture of how gloriously beautiful and good God's authority actually is.